There is a word that follows people through their entire lives like a shadow they cannot name. Broken. Not always said out loud, rarely said to your face directly, but present in the background of the inner critic's running commentary. Present in the specific quality of shame that surfaces when the patterns repeat despite genuine effort to change them. Present in the quiet, persistent, largely unexamined assumption that the difficulty you experience, the emotional reactivity, the self-sabotage, the specific quality of suffering that seems to follow you, regardless of how the circumstances change, is evidence of something fundamentally wrong with who you are. Gabor Maté spent 50 years making a case against that word. Not through spiritual encouragement or therapeutic reframing or the various forms of gentle reassurance that the healing industry offers as consolation. Through clinical precision. Through the specific, documented, neurologically grounded account of what the patterns that look like brokenness actually are, where they actually come from, and what they actually represent about the person who carries them. His case was simple, and it was radical. You were never broken, not once, not in any of the moments that felt most like evidence of fundamental inadequacy, not in the patterns you've been most ashamed of, not in the suffering you've carried longest, or the behaviors you have most consistently wished you could change. You were adaptive. And that distinction between broken and adaptive is not a reframe designed to make you feel better about something that is genuinely problematic. It is a precise clinical description of what is actually true about the human psychological development process, and what is actually true about every pattern you've ever experienced as evidence of your own brokenness. An adaptation is not a malfunction. It is a solution, a specific, intelligent, often brilliantly engineered solution to a problem that the organism encountered in its developmental environment. The problem of how to maintain connection when the environment required suppression of certain authentic expressions. The problem of how to remain safe when the environment was unpredictably dangerous. The problem of how to preserve the capacity for relationship when the relational environment was inconsistent or conditional or in some way inadequate to what the developing nervous system genuinely required. These problems were real. The solutions the nervous system developed were real. And the cost of those solutions, the specific patterns that have followed you into adult life and that feel from the inside like evidence of something wrong, that cost is also real. But it is not the cost of brokenness. It is the cost of intelligence applied to survival in circumstances that required a particular kind of intelligence. This is the spiritual truth that changes everything. Not because it is comfortable. It is not always comfortable. Because genuinely seeing the adaptation also means genuinely seeing the original conditions that required it. And that seeing involves its own quality of grief, but because it is accurate. And accuracy in the interior life produces something that comfort cannot. It produces the specific quality of genuine understanding that allows the relationship with the self to change at the level where the relationship with the self was formed. If that distinction between broken and adaptive has just shifted something in you, even slightly, drop 777 in the comments, not as performance, as honest acknowledgement that something just changed in the way you understand your own history. Type 777 and let us go into the full truth of it. The human nervous system is, among other things, an extraordinary learning machine. Its primary function in the developmental period is not the production of psychological health in any abstract sense. It is the production of survival. Specifically, the survival of the particular organism in the particular environment in which it finds itself. And it accomplishes this through a process of continuous, largely automatic, deeply intelligent adaptation to whatever that environment actually is, not to what it should ideally be, not to what developmental psychology says it needs to be for optimal outcomes, but to what it actually is. When the actual environment is characterized by consistent, warm, attuned, genuinely responsive caregiving, when the child's emotional states are consistently met with accurate reflection and genuine presence, The nervous system develops in specific ways. Regulatory capacity develops. The capacity for genuine intimacy develops. The ability to trust one's own perceptions develops. The specific quality of secure attachment that allows the self to be both genuinely connected to others and genuinely distinct from them develops. When the actual environment is characterized by something less than that, not necessarily abuse, not necessarily dramatic neglect, but any of the ordinary, human, entirely common forms of inadequacy that real caregiving environments produce, the nervous system adapts differently. It develops not the capacities of the ideally nourished environment, but the capacities required for the actual one. The child whose emotional expression was consistently met with parental anxiety learns to suppress emotional expression, not because suppression is healthy, because in that specific environment, emotional expression produced consequences that were more costly than suppression. The adaptation is intelligent, the adaptation is costly, and the adaptation is not brokenness. The child whose caregiving was inconsistent, present and warm sometimes, absent or dysregulated at others, develops hypervigilance. The continuous, exhausting, finely tuned monitoring of the emotional atmosphere of the environment, that is the nervous system's solution to the problem of unpredictability. Again, intelligent, again, costly, again, not brokenness. The child whose needs were treated as inconvenient or excessive develops self-suppression. The specific, systematic, eventually automatic override of the self's own genuine needs in order to maintain connection with the people whose responsiveness was conditional on the absence of those needs. The adaptation that produces the adult who cannot ask for help, cannot receive care without immediately redirecting it, cannot acknowledge their own needs without the accompanying surge of shame that the original environment attached to the expression of those needs. Every one of these adaptations was a solution. Every one of them is still running. In many cases running so automatically and so completely below conscious awareness that the person carrying them has never experienced them as adaptations at all, has experienced them as simply who they are, as the permanent, essential, unchangeable features of a self that is simply, irreducibly this way. And that is the specific confusion that the distinction between broken and adaptive is designed to dissolve. Because a self that is simply this way cannot be questioned, cannot be traced to its origin, cannot be understood as the product of specific circumstances that no longer apply in the same form, cannot be recognized as the intelligent solution to a problem that the adult life may not pose in the same way the developmental environment did. But an adaptation can be all of those things. An adaptation can be seen, and when it is seen, genuinely, honestly, with the specific quality of compassionate curiosity that genuine seeing requires, the relationship with it changes, not immediately, not completely, but genuinely, in the direction of greater choice about whether the adaptation is still serving the genuine self, or whether the genuine self, with the resources of the adult it has become, has more available to it now than the adaptation's original programming allows. Now I want to give you the 7 specific ways this understanding you were never broken, you were adaptive, changes your relationship with the patterns you have been most ashamed of. The anger that arrives too quickly and too completely is not evidence of a fundamentally volatile character. It is the adaptation of a nervous system that learned in a specific environment that threats arrived without adequate warning, and that the only reliable protection was the hair-trigger response system. The anger is intelligent. It was built for a real problem, and it can be understood, worked with, and gradually updated, not through shame and suppression, which simply reinforce the original conditions that built it, but through the genuine understanding that it was built for circumstances that the present may not require it to manage in exactly the same way. The withdrawal that occurs when genuine intimacy becomes available is not evidence of an inability to love. It is the adaptation of a nervous system that learned in a specific environment that genuine closeness was followed by loss or conditional withdrawal or the specific quality of being seen and found insufficient. The withdrawal is protective. It was built for a real danger. And it can be recognized, approached with curiosity, and gradually softened through the accumulated experience of genuine closeness that does not produce the outcome the adaptation was built to prevent. The compulsive self-sufficiency that cannot accept help or care or genuine support is not evidence of arrogance or invulnerability. It is the adaptation of a nervous system that learned in a specific environment that genuine need was not reliably met, that depending on others produced disappointment more often than relief, that the safest available position was behind a wall of functional independence that required nothing from anyone. The self-sufficiency is a genuine achievement. It was built at real cost, and it can be recognized as the protection it is, rather than the identity it has been mistaken for, and gradually, tentatively, expanded to include the genuine receiving that the adaptation has been preventing. The perfectionism that produces the specific, exhausting quality of never being quite enough is not evidence of excessively high standards or a character given to unnecessary self-torture. It is the adaptation of a nervous system that learned in a specific environment that conditional love was the primary form available, that the warmth and the approval and the specific quality of being genuinely received were most reliably accessed through performance that met a particular standard. The perfectionism is logical. It was the most reliable strategy available for accessing what the child genuinely needed. And it can be recognized as strategy rather than identity, and gradually, with genuine patience and genuine compassion for the child who built it, updated toward the understanding that the adult self's worth does not require continuous performance to be real. The chronic people-pleasing that cannot say no without the accompanying surge of anxiety is not evidence of weakness or insufficient self-respect. It is the adaptation of a nervous system that learned in a specific environment that the expression of genuine preference or genuine refusal produced consequences, withdrawal, disapproval, the specific loss of connection that the developing person could not afford. The people-pleasing is survival intelligence. It was built for a real problem. And it can be recognized, honored for what it protected, and gradually supplemented by the adult capacity for genuine choice that the original environment did not provide sufficient safety to develop. The dissociation that removes the self from full presence to its own experience during difficulty is not evidence of psychological fragility or an inability to cope. It is the adaptation of a nervous system that learned in a specific environment that full presence to what was happening was more than the available resources could sustain. The dissociation is protection. It was the nervous system's most available means of managing what exceeded its capacity to process while remaining present. And it can be recognized as such, not as malfunction, but as intelligent management of genuine overwhelm. And gradually, with genuine support and genuine patience, the capacity for full presence can be built in circumstances that are genuinely safer than the original ones that required its absence. The seventh pattern, the one that Gabor Maté returned to as the most pervasive and the most costly of all, the chronic, largely unconscious, deeply embedded belief that the genuine self, not the performing self, not the adapting self, but the actual, original, unmodified, genuine self is not fundamentally enough. This is not a belief that most people would endorse if asked directly. Most people, if asked whether they believe they are fundamentally inadequate, would say no, would point to evidence to the contrary, would invoke the language of self-worth and self-acceptance that the contemporary culture of psychological literacy has made widely available. But the belief does not live in the conscious mind where the language of self-worth can reach it. It lives in the body, in the specific felt quality of shame that surfaces when the genuine self is exposed, in the reflexive reach for performance when genuine presence will be more appropriate, in the chronic, below-conscious orientation of the inner life toward the management of an inadequacy that has never been directly named because it has never needed to be. It simply is the water in which the self has always swum. This belief is the adaptation. It is the nervous system's conclusion from the specific evidence of the specific developmental environment in which the self was formed. And it is wrong. Not wrong in the sense that the evidence was fabricated. The experiences that produced the conclusion were real. But wrong in the sense that the conclusion drawn from those experiences was always, in the deepest and most important sense, inaccurate. The genuine self, the actual, original, pre-adaptive, irreducibly personal self that arrived in the world before the adaptations were built around it, was never insufficient. It was never too much or not enough or fundamentally inadequate to the requirements of genuine love and genuine belonging. It was a self that encountered an environment whose adequacy was limited in specific ways and that drew from that encounter the most logical, available conclusion about its own nature. And that conclusion was wrong. Not as the spiritual encouragement, as the clinical observation repeated across 5 decades of sitting with human beings who had arrived to different paths and different specific histories at the same fundamental confusion between the environment's inadequacy and the self's inadequacy, between what the environment could not provide and what the self did not deserve. You were not broken. The environment was limited. The adaptation was intelligent. The conclusion about your own fundamental insufficiency was the most logical available evidence from the available evidence, and it was wrong. That is the spiritual truth that changes everything. And the privilege of a lifetime, the one Gabor Maté pointed toward with everything he had across 50 years of genuine clinical honesty, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not the adapted version, not the version that learned to be enough by being what was required, who you truly are, which was always, already, genuinely enough, before the first adaptation was built, before the first conclusion was drawn from the first evidence that suggested otherwise. The truth has always been simpler than the wound told you. You were never broken. You were never broken. You were never broken.